live from The Hague, the Brussels, and Mumbai. It's ZN Live.
Live.
That's right. We're very excited today. We have a special guest, Bert Hubert, who is an entrepreneur. He's got a science background. He's writing a book about DNA, and he's got extensive views on a number of topics from AI to vaccines. But I wanted to start with one question, Bert, which is there's Edelman just released its trust barometer, a very interesting survey they do every year. And one of their findings was that people trust scientists more than any other profession in society. And of course, you're very interested in science communication. What do you make of that finding, and what do you think we can do with that?
Yeah, well, I think in general it matches my experience. So I've been active in a number of scientific fields, so a little bit in astronomy, DNA, and physics, and biology. And I found out in general that from all the sort of fields that I've worked in, scientists are sort of the least corrupted field. On the other hand, they were always talking about money. So if you meet a scientist, the first thing they say, do you have funding or can I get funding? So it does not mean that these are all sort of charities working together. But if you look at the field of DNA, for example, or astronomy, then yeah, these scientists, they are honestly, they wake up in the morning and they want to do science. They want to learn more and they want to tell everyone about it. And I think in that sense, sort of the public is right in saying that there is little duplicity going on, and these people really want to improve the world, and they also want to get many publications while doing so. I have to make that clear. So what could you do with that? Actually, if you put a scientist on TV or you allow them to blog or write about what they are doing, they can be extremely credible. Because if the scientist says, look, I have studied this virus and it has evolved like this typically, and I think that it might do that by now, and there is no political spin on it, there is no advertising next to it, there is no cookie banner next to it, it's just a real scientist telling about her work. And that is extremely credible, and that can be very good for achieving your communications goals.
Now, it's a very good point, and we're facing some major challenges as a society. We just, I would say, came out of the pandemic. Arguably, we had a pandemic, and of course, the conversation around vaccines was all about science. I mean, it was trying to understand what is a risk, what does a vaccine do, how do you approach it. And actually, if you look at the media, a lot of it was quite confusing, and a lot of the things that I think we see on social media and in the media is kind of makes you feel a little depressed about how people are approaching science. So I find that insight quite reassuring. But do you actually think that people understand? Because I don't think it's just the scientists. I think it's the scientific mindset. So how well do you think people understand the scientific mindset and are able to use those tools when confronting these problems, whether it's vaccines or climate change?
Yeah. So I think that is very good. And you mentioned how the people would respond to things and how they can use it. And that sort of underlies a assumption that would be communicating directly with everyone. And that's very difficult. If you try to take a difficult scientific subject, if it's nitrogen deposition or the climate change or whatever, and you just flood people with science, they might not be able to accept that into their world because you're not speaking their language. People are able to digest really complicated things because we often think in communications that we have to make it simpler, and simpler. Yet people watch Game of Thrones, which is like 12,000 characters and is extremely difficult to follow. I cannot, it's too complicated for me. But lots of people are apparently able to do it. And that means that we should not be afraid of saying complicated things. But the key insight, and that's one of the reasons, so I wrote a blog post like 2 years ago to explain the mRNA corona vaccines. And that blog post was viewed by over 2 million people. And it was translated by volunteers in 25 languages. I was recently at a party with hundreds of people, and I found out that like half of the people there had read my blog post. So, but it's not for the general public. It's written for geeks. It's written for nerds. And that brings me to my point. Very often when we try to convey a message, we try to maybe convey it to as many people as possible in the hopes that they will learn from that. I would advocate also for an indirect approach, where you say we also communicate more in depth, more science, more background, where we realize that lots of people may not be able to personally benefit from that. However, we have all these technical people around, people with a scientific background, engineers, or anyone doing advanced stuff, and they might be able to benefit from it. And then you get a situation that there is a reservoir of well educated people that are knowledgeable about the subject. And they have family members, they have friends, they have colleagues. And quite often, at least I know in my world, I have for any subject, I know if I need to know about this subject, I know someone who is an expert in that. And I will rely on what they think. And I think it's worthwhile when communicating to aim your message also at these knowledgeable people and to give them the knowledge how something works. And when then in a family gathering, someone asks, is this nitrogen problem really that bad? Then the knowledgeable person will be able to say, yeah, well, this is what is going on. And they will, in fact, be doing your communication for them from a position where they are already trusted by their community. So, rounding this off, I do think it is very useful for any body or agency or organization that wants to communicate a message to not just aim for the largest audience, but also aim for the indirect audience where you say we're going to educate these trusted experts in the community and we are going to give them more detail with
Yeah.
which will help them educate the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's such
Yeah,
a good point. So, for example, with the vaccine communication, or other healthcare related communication, we know that mothers in most families are the ones that make the decision. So and they are really looking into matters. They're not making rash decisions. So we want to make sure we target the communication to them on the channels that they use. We go into depth because they're not taking superficial decisions. So instead of having some superficial messages, we go into infographics. We give them those detailed messages about their children, about the effect that the healthcare measures have on the different members of the family. And it is also true that, for example, in my family, I'm the one that advises the different members of the family about influenza vaccines, for example, or COVID vaccines, and nobody reads anything except for me. So I would be one of those people that should be targeted. It's an excellent point, Phil.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is basically amplification, and what we sometimes call an influencer strategy. So you identify the people who within the different communities can amplify the message, face to face or on their own smaller groups or on WhatsApp or whatever they use. And I think it's about conversations in different groups. It's not about trying to reach 1 million people necessarily with your message, but getting to the right people with the right arguments. And I think the bigger objective that we should have as communicators and as a society is to really keep coming back to the fundamentals of science. And that means that you have to keep going back to the question, okay, what does this mean? And you shouldn't accept anything that's just delivered to you just because somebody says, oh, this, if somebody says this vaccine is wonderful, you are allowed to check the data and to say, well, what does that mean? How is that defined? What is what's a test period? What's a risk, etc. And I think what people need to do is to ask themselves those questions, have different conversations. Now, what you said, and I think this is very interesting, when you look at the discussion around vaccines and this very polarized environment we're in today, where people take extreme positions. Even the people, and I think people tend to dismiss the other views, saying, oh, you're either corrupt or you're an idiot, you're not educated, etc. But a lot of the time, both sides are spending quite a lot of time, digging into internet sites and forums and groups, and they might come up with the weirdest kind of views, but they spent a lot of time investing in that study. Now, how do you address somebody who is what you referred to before as a house nerd? If they're going down, those weird conspiracy rabbit holes, which, we've been exploring them because we work in that business. So we try to understand what's happening, and they can be very convincing. They can involve, lots of reports and studies and things like that.
Yeah.
They just all happen to be, fundamentally flawed. So how do you teach people to basically challenge themselves? Because it doesn't mean they don't want to look at the facts, but they're just pulled into, I would say, facts that are very badly constructed and in bad faith.
So the key thing there, and we really have ourselves, and I regard myself as a communicator in this sense. We have ourselves to blame in a big way. So we have like 10% people that are polarized one way, 10% of people that are polarized the other way, and then we have 80% of the people in between that are severely confused. And as a concrete example, 2 years ago, when the corona vaccines arrived, the Dutch government had a website where you could report side effects. And that database was, and there was a disclaimer on that database that said, look, everyone can report anything here. So if you turned into a horse after being vaccinated, you could report that there and it would appear on the Dutch government website, patient turned into a horse. And but the site itself already said, look, this is a raw website and everything is on here. So this is really only for scientists, and for good information, you should go to the Dutch government website and they will explain to you what the risks of the corona vaccine are. And there's no link. So we just tell these people this data is not good and you should go hunt for your own good data. So, and I was in a discussion as a trial 2 years ago. I went on Facebook and on LinkedIn and I engaged with the radicalized community to just figure out what's going on there, because I was not going there to convince them, because that's, you don't need to convince the 10% extremes. So I went there as a sort of observing person to figure out what's going on here. And I got challenged. People said, look, the Dutch government, they're not clear about the vaccine risks. And I was like, hey, I think there are. So I went to this website where I could read the people that got struck by lightning after vaccination. And I tried to find the government summary. I tried to find the rebuttal, the place where the Dutch government says, look, these are the risks of having corona, and they're terrible. And these are the risks of the vaccine, and they're like 20 times smaller. And you could, at a very early stage, you could have scientifically stated that. So based on the last few weeks' observations, we had 2,000 people dying of corona, and we had 7 people that had the vaccine problem. But they didn't do it. They didn't do it. So they left the two sides up, the one side with all the raw data, and then you would have to hunt for the other side, and you couldn't find it. But I could find all these other sites that made these summaries that 12 people turned into a horse last week. And so one of the tricks is not to convince the extremes, but to be brave and go out as an authority and say what you know, and do not leave a hole. And the thing is, I have worked in governments. I have only just left government. So I know the feeling that people that work there, their number one priority is not being wrong. Because being wrong, you get blamed for that. It's terrible. So you end up often with no communications instead of brief communications or maybe brave communications. But I think that if you would, in that first week, you would have thought, look, these are the statistics of the vaccines for this week, and we will update you next week with what happens again. And here's a trusted person that will summarize that for you. Then we would not have left that hole. And now we honestly, and I also engaged with the government itself because I know these people. So I said, look, why don't you have this page? And we're working on the communications plan and these other stuff. No, you have to be early, and you have to be right, and you have to be credible. And maybe sometimes that means that you come back next week and you say, well, we got the numbers a little bit wrong, and we're correcting them now because we are real human beings.
Yeah. And I think you're saying that, the key point here is that science is about being wrong. I mean, you cannot embark on a scientific project without being completely prepared at every stage to be proven wrong. In fact, that's the scientific process.
Yeah.
And on communication, I think that's been a really, really big problem, is that whenever authorities were asserting, okay, now you need to wear a mask, actually now you don't. And now you need to, the vaccine doesn't spread the COVID, etc. And with contradictions that basically emerge from the data, which I think if you understand science, you just say, okay, we've got revised data.
We learned more.
Changing recommendations. But I saw a lot of clips which were like, hey, look at Fauci contradicting himself over this statement. And you go like, that's completely natural. There's nothing wrong with that. And people get very angry at that statement. So I think it's understanding that being wrong and being able to revise your own opinions is really the key to the process.
But that's really antithetical to how many people in communications work, because walking back your statement is like the worst thing that could happen. Mm-hmm. And what I've seen is that this role of sort of the giving the narrative, doing the explanation, is then often left to people from academia or government agencies that are somewhat removed from the action. So, for example, in the Netherlands, we have the National Statistics Bureau, and they have a professor at the university, and he goes out to explain all their statistics. So he takes all the numbers and he says, look, it may look like the following is happening, but this is the 30-year trend, and actually this is not a significant change. And he can do this kind of thing because he is actually far enough removed that the minister will not be summoned to government if he accidentally got it wrong, for example, because he is at this agency. But still, he gives a lot of insight and has a large fan base, which means that whenever he says, look, this is not as big a problem as it appears, or the other way around, he might say, look, this looks like a small change, but it's really a big change.
Yeah.
That goes a long way. And one of the recommendations I would have, that if you want to have this sort of more in-depth communications, but you want to be, you are worried about your brand, because you are worried about this clip that someone ever have to walk back something, find people that are somewhat removed from the action. Maybe have a scientist on staff and say, look, this is our staff scientist, and he explains stuff to you. And maybe once in a while he gets it wrong and he say, hey, that's science, and he got it wrong, and he also explained how he got it wrong. So I would really recommend for more people, because now we are relying on kind journalists that do this stuff. So the Financial Times has a wonderful COVID explainer, John Murdoch, something. And I do sometimes some of this explanatory work. In Germany, you had Christian Droste, which is like a sort of chief scientist, but he was not on the official Corona Commission. So he could also say more. So that is an area where you can enhance your community without worrying too much about burning your brand.
Yeah. Now I want to quickly jump to another topic, which is you're writing a book on DNA and communication about DNA, kind of the broader topic. And I want to touch on two things at once. One is the DNA, and the second one is artificial intelligence, and that trend that both of us are very interested. So I think, Lior, you actually had a question on that.
Hi. Yes, I know you're writing a book on DNA. I'm really fascinated about it. Love to hear more about it. When is it coming out? What is it about? And tell me everything.
Yeah, so the idea is, of course, that all of life is built on DNA, and we are not selling that well enough. So DNA, you can of course explain DNA and say, well, this complicated molecule, and there's carbon in there, and there's nitrogen in there, and that is chemically speaking true. It's also biologically speaking true, but it's no fun at all. But if you tell people, say, look, DNA, if you see a blade of grass, it is powered by the exact same DNA system that you are, and there is literally no life on Earth that does not speak the same digital language. And actually, if you start looking at DNA and you sort of go past the fact that it's a really complicated molecule, you can find in there that it's actually sort of really a programming language of life, just one that's so complex that it's very difficult to understand. And I think it's very important for people to really understand what that means, because we are getting more and more DNA tests going on, and we are going to apply more and more AI to DNA, which means that we are going to apply a poorly understood technology to a poorly understood part of science. And the results are going to be, well, as fascinating as they will be terrible. And I think it would be good that if people know more about this world. And the angle I have chosen in this, there are lots of people that are technically good. They know about bits and bytes, they know about mathematics, and they know they can comprehend complicated things. But they do not need an explanation of DNA in terms of sugar molecules. They want to understand it in terms of information. And that is really the goal of my book, which is as an audience for like technical people. So it's not a mass market thing, except that there, of course, are hundreds of millions of people that are good with technology. And I hope that this will broaden their understanding of what it all means. And also, it's just a fascinating story. I mean, if you read this as a nerd, it will blow your mind.
But there are two types of DNA tests. I understand you're not an advocate for these tests, but there are two types, right? One is your heritage, and one is your disease profile. Yeah. Are you saying we shouldn't do either, or the part of where you come from? Also in the context of fighting racism and so on, do you think there's nothing against doing that?
Yeah, so there is the curiosity thing going on. So you can
Mhm.
do a DNA test, and it will indeed quite reliably tell you that there is a tiny bit of Indian heritage in your DNA that you didn't know about. And it's sort of a fascinating, fun fact that might enrich your life. It might also tell you that your actual father is not your father, and that's quite that happens a lot, and and that takes the fun out of it. Because you might have a sort of quite a rotten week after that. So in medical circles, it is always you can test for many things, and many things will give you information that you cannot do anything with to improve your life. And so that goes about figuring out your father or your uncle or whatever. And it specifically, I have in my book a whole chapter on the predictive abilities of DNA. And it turns out that even the strongest predictions that come out of DNA right now are often not borne out in reality. So you might get some terrible news, and it might never happen. And and even if it will happen, there is a question on could you have done anything with that information? And I think that if you look at what the current DNA companies are doing, they are basically a scam for collecting as much DNA information as possible and telling you some stories about it. And I would not recommend doing. I'm not going to do it. And I come from a family with genetic disease in there, so I would actually be motivated of doing this. But I would only do it if it would tell me something that I could that would be actionable for me.
So
And
that's a very interesting question, because what about adopted children, or and I always thought it's not good for them not to know what kind of diseases they're prone to. And you're saying no, actually, it doesn't matter. Don't
unless
bother.
it's something you can act on, if it's
Yeah,
something where you can say I should no longer eat sugar,
yeah.
that's something you can do. Or I should no longer drink alcohol. That's something I do. But the sort of vague prediction that says you have like a 20% elevated chance of ever getting dementia. What would you do with that?
Well, for dementia, you can be more active with your
You,
brain.
you should be doing that anyhow.
You should do that anyway. Yeah,
Uh,
that's true. But if you know you're more prone, you might be more likely to anyway. We're getting into details. Phil,
read the book. Read the book.
I will. I will.
Yeah, we don't have much time, so I just want to get one question in about AI. You've mentioned that this is also an area you're looking at. This has been the month or the last month of Chat GPT, where AI became, I would say, mainstream.
Yeah.
It's been there. The technology has been there. We hear that much more advanced systems are there, but I think for the first time we're seeing applications that a lot of people who didn't really fully understand the capabilities are now seeing them. Do you think that we're at a kind of transitional moment where AI is about to come in a significant way this year? Because I think Google is now under pressure to release their own version, and basically they don't want to let OpenAI catch up.
Yeah.
And how do you see that as a big positive? Are you scared about the AI taking over the world?
I am mega scared. But not literally for the AI to take over the world directly. So I'm not that worried about ChatGPT taking over the world on its own. The problem that what happened in the past few months, and by the way, the version what ChatGPT released had been around for over 2 years. So, but we just hadn't seen it yet. And the risk now is that these systems can be extremely impressive. And by many measures, many objective measures, people will say, ChatGPT made a mistake, it didn't get my joke, whatever, or it fabulated some data. The thing is, if you ask random people questions, they will also fabulate data and not get your jokes. And if I mentally test ChatGPT against most of the people I know, for almost any question I can ask, ChatGPT will give a better answer. The problem is I don't know when that is true. So occasionally it is extremely not true. And the problem now is it's very difficult for us to predict the future. So when nuclear energy was predicted, people thought that everyone would soon have nuclear helicopters. That was in the 1950s, and we would all be traveling around on nuclear mopeds. And that didn't happen. But they did change the world through atomic bombs and that kind of stuff. And similarly, if anyone says I can predict what will happen with AI right now, I'm 100% certain they are wrong, because you don't know. But the issue is people are going to use it already. And that means that if you apply for a job, you might quite soon find that your CV gets read by an AI and you get rejected by the AI. because people have a lot of faith in what the computer says. Computer says no. Strangely enough, people believe that to a very large extent. So we are heading for a world where people are going to deploy this technology even before we know all the downsides and risks of it. And because I've been delving into it personally, one of the huge risks of all these AI systems is that they appear to be confident when, if you look under the if you look behind the curtains, you find that these systems are not confident. But that takes a certain matter of sophistication to say, okay, I have this computer, but I'm going to disregard its answers because it was not sure about itself. ChatGPT, interestingly enough, you can coax it into telling you how confident it is about what it is saying. No one does that. So I am extremely worried that this technology is now very exciting and could help us tremendously in many ways. And we're just going to try the hell out of it and see what works. And so, to end on a note, you see that there are people that are saying, hey, ChatGPT is going to help me write text. And it's going to improve my work because I can generate more text faster now. And that's a very first order prediction where you say, my job is going to stay the same, but I'm going to be better at it because of I have ChatGPT now. But quite soon you might not have the job because people are just writing the bullshit happen by ChatGPT directly. And I think for communications, this is going to be terrible because we already have no deficit of bullshit online. And now we have technology that can create it at a faster rate than ever before. And that's going to make our lives as communicators even more difficult because we have to break through that and stand apart from this mediocre content. So I am super worried, and we will have a tough job communicating the limits on it and telling people what is good, what is not good, and what you should be doing with it. And while superficially it might appear to make our life easier, it will make the life of people that create mediocre content far more easier than it will make the lives of people that strive for excellence in their communications.
Okay, so a note of caution on DNA testing and a note of caution on AI. Now we have time for some recommendations. So, Bert, I'll go to you first. What is your recommendation to our audience?
One of the best science communicators we ever had was Carl Sagan. And he wrote a book, and it's now, I think, 25 years old. And it had all kinds of warnings on how the television would disrupt our processing of information. And basically, it predicted like everything in the world of pseudoscience and radicalization and polarization right now. And the book is all the more powerful because it describes how this happens. But he describes it from a slightly different world than we live in right now, because he identified TV as the problem and the internet as a sort of nascent thing because it was around. But it's all the more credible because he made these predictions 25 years ago. And there's a lot in the book about indeed how the system of science is fallible, but it's still the best that we have. But in short, if you want to study science communications and how it can help save us from the darkness of the medieval things that we might be sinking into with people clutching to their crystals to heal them from imaginary diseases, it's a really good book. Even if it's 25 years old, it's a classic.
Great. VR, your recommendation of the week.
Yes, I wanted my recommendation to go follow yours because it's a recommendation that follows your recommendation.
Okay, so I will make my recommendation first. Then I'm going to recommend that you check out the Edelman Barometer, Trust Barometer that I mentioned at the beginning for 2023. Got some really interesting insights about polarization, science communication, how business is seen as the most credible source of trust, actually, in this particular environment. It's the first time there's such a massive discrepancy between business, government, journalism. And so I think that it's very interesting. I wrote a post about it earlier, so we're going to share the post. And I also want to just mention that Nico Shalato posted about ChatGPT can be your best friend as well as your worst enemy. It depends if you don't understand how it works. And I think I would agree with that. I think, we are in a world with AI, and I think what we need to do is learn to use it, to adapt to it, because I think if you do it right, I think there'll be quite a lot of opportunities to improve communication on certain topics, but that's a longer discussion to have. Liara, what is your recommendation?
Yes, I have two recommendations today. The first one follows your recommendation, Phil, about the Edelman report about the Trust Barometer 2023, which is very surprising that businesses are the most trust entity this year, above NGOs, above political institutions, and that CEOs are also very well trusted, like Phil himself, of course, is not a surprise that Phil is well trusted, but also other CEOs. And so that made me think that it is very important for companies to communicate really well, to communicate around key topics. And I gave a LinkedIn training last week to an association. We do these kind of trainings a lot. So I was thinking that my recommendation for companies and organizations is to really get their communication up to par, to take trainings, to get a brand ambassador training, social media trainings for their employees, for their key people like CEOs and other key executives, to make sure that they know how to communicate, just like Bert said before, because you are very well trusted, but it really comes down to communication and to make sure that you get your key values out there. That was my first recommendation. My second recommendation, I want to bring this back because it's day 126 of the Iran revolution. And my recommendation is that you help the people in Iran to get a new leadership in place, a democratically elected leadership, because if there's new leadership in Iran, that will change the world, not just in the Middle East, around the world. It will stop promoting terror around the world. That will change everything really in the world. And so make sure that your leaders no longer support the regime, withdraw their ambassadors, make sure that you bring the issue forward on your own social media channels. Talk to your elected leaders and say that you no longer want them to talk to you, because even our own people here in the EU, in the Netherlands, everywhere in the world, they are still talking to the Iran leadership as though they are normal people that you can talk and negotiate with. Make sure that the Iran deal is off the table, and use your voices, use your Twitter channel, use your Instagram channel, use your Facebook channel, use wherever you are. On Mastodon, it's a good channel as well. So thank you. I just wanted to use those 1 minute, that 1 minute, to bring those brave people of Iran to the forefront. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much, Bert. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing those insights. You have a website. You're working on your book, so people can check you out. We will see you online, and have a fantastic weekend. That's all for us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.